this is the very first time I've ever spoken about a picture book. So I don't know how to do this because I'm always tempted to curse because I don't know what I do. I feel like it's illegal now. But so I actually wrote down a couple things. So I wanted to just tell you guys a couple things. I want to talk about buses, grandmothers, and Christian Robinson. So buses. When I first moved to Los Angeles, I was fresh out of grad school. I moved to Venice Beach, and I was so excited. But according to a Snapple fact that I once read, there are 3 times more cars than people in LA. So I was so excited because I was going to get my first car. I ran a little bit of a scam. I feel bad admitting this, but I used student loan money to buy a used car. And I went to the paper and I found this incredible, beautiful Accord. It was about 10 years old. It was my dream car. An Accord was always my dream car. I know that sounds silly, but it really was. And so I found this old man, and we met in this parking lot of a grocery store, and he was the nicest old man. He did have an eye patch, which seemed a little sinister, and we were talking, and I did a test drive, and he sat in the passenger seat, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I want to be a writer." And he was so nice. He was like, "I write poetry," and he had a cane and an eye patch. And so I was like, I love this old man. I want to hug him. I bought the car. I gave him the money in cash. And then I held off on registering it at the DMV for a while because I couldn't afford isn't there like the tax money, right, or something like that? So I held off for 3 months. Then I went to the DMV in Santa Monica with my brand new beautiful Accord. And I went into the place to register it. And I will never forget, the woman working the counter was like taking a long time. And I was like, what's going on? Everybody else is going up and doing their thing and leaving. And I was like, is everything okay? And she's like, yeah, just hold on a second. And I was like, okay. 30 minutes later, I was still standing there, and the cops came in. And they whisked me into the back room. And they were like, you stole that car. And I was like, no, this old man in an eye patch. I don't believe you. You stole this car, and you're trying to register it. And I was like, no, I swear. So they drilled me for like 30 minutes. It was like a scene right out of Serial. Do you guys know that?
Yes.
I'm so hooked, by the way. I don't think he did it. I don't think, but anyway. So I ended up having to be driven home by the cops. They finally believed me. And I was sitting next to this police dog. I'll never forget it. The dog was just staring at me and panting. And I was like, oh my God, I lost my Accord. And I got to my apartment. And so now I knew I wasn't going to have a car. I called my dad and I was like, Dad, that old man, I bought a stolen car. And he just laughed. So I was like, I'm not going to get sympathy from him. But so, in other words, to fast forward, for the next 3 years, I lived in LA with no car. So I rode the bus everywhere. I rode the number 2 bus to work. I worked at MTV for a while. And there was just a brief little thing. There was this one older Mexican man who reminded me of back home. He didn't speak English, but he was so nice to me. I'll never forget this guy. For 2 straight years, every day we'd be on the same bus stop, waiting for the bus. And I was a huge reader at this point, and I would always go to where the sun was, because it was kind of cold in the morning, and I would be reading a book, and he would always do the same thing. He'd be like, hey, and he'd get me on the bus when the bus came. And so I'll never forget, at the end of those 2 years, when it was my last bus ride of my life in LA, before I moved here, I gave him a copy of 100 Years of Solitude in Spanish, because I knew he was Mexican. And we never said a word to each other, but I gave him that, and I'll never forget that guy. And I'll never forget those years on the bus in LA, because you just meet a different race of people, breed of people. It's working class people, and it reminded me of where I grew up in San Diego. So that's that. Stolen car. So I ended up on the bus. Fast forward many years, and my agent, he sent me this link and said, hey, I'm thinking about signing this artist. His name's Christian Robinson. He goes, what do you think of his stuff? And I looked at his stuff, and it's the guy who did these, and I was blown away. I mean, I just loved, I'd worked with Kadir Nelson before, and Kadir is like a fine artist, and it's just beautiful stuff that you would hang in a museum. And then I looked at Kadir's stuff, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so fun, and I could see a kid loving this. And I told Steve Malk, my agent, I was like, you've got to get this guy. This guy's amazing. okay, after a while, he said, hey, do you think there's a book in this one illustration? It was his mother, or his grandmother, and him on the bus. And I was like, yeah, there's probably something there. And he goes, write the book. And so I immediately went to, my time on the bus in LA, and I knew he had been on the bus, so I wanted to do the bus. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was my grandmother. He was with his grandmother in the photo, and then I just sort of accessed my time with my grandmother, and I wanted to just briefly tell you one of my favorite things about her. So I'm mixed race, I'm Mexican and white. But my mom was a foster kid, so we didn't know her side of the family. So I only knew the Mexican side. And my grandmother, she was born in Tijuana, but she was lighter than me. So she was full Mexican, but she was very light-skinned, a lot of Spanish blood. And she had this way where all through my childhood, she would do the same thing, either in the highs or the lows of life. So one time I got really, really in trouble. I was about 6th grade. At a family gathering, I was goofing off or something, and my dad, very tough Mexican father, got really angry at me, kind of yelled at me in front of everybody, and it got kind of quiet and awkward. And my grandmother came up to me, and she would do what she did, which is she'd just look at me and pat me on the knee. And it was her way of just kind of like soothing the situation. Fast forward, senior year, me and my dad actually didn't get along too well, so I actually didn't live at home my senior year. So I lived with a lot of friends, and then I ended up living with my grandmother for a while. And the first day I got there, it was kind of a long commute for me to go to school, but I was like, this is kind of family, so maybe I should stay with her. The first morning I woke up, I will never forget, she made eggs and tortillas with chorizo, and they were so good, it was amazing. The whole house smelled beautiful, and I ate the stuff, and my grandma had to talk with me, and she's like, so do you think you could go home, tomorrow and live back with your dad and your mom? And I was like, you know what, maybe I should stay here a little longer. And then she just patted me on the knee, and I went to school. And I lived with her for a long time, for like 6 months. Fast forward to college, and I had one of the greatest things ever happen to me. I won this huge writing contest. I'll never forget, I was walking through the English department, and I saw one of those flyers that has little leaflets, like you're supposed to take one to enter this contest. I ripped off the whole thing. So I was like, if nobody else knows about it. So I took the thing with me, and it was this writing contest for Northern California colleges. So there were a few colleges, smaller private schools, this contest. And if you won, you got $2,000. And that's a lot of money when you're a student. And so I took it. I applied. It was the first time I'd ever sent my writing in to anybody. I'd never shown it to anybody either. And like a few months later, I got the call, and they said, you won the contest. And I was so amazed. And so it was kind of a big deal. I had to do this reading in front of all these professors. And I was this scrubby basketball playing guy. I was on scholarship in college. And I was so out of my element. And I'll never forget, my mom and my grandmother came up to hear me read. And I'll never forget, I read, and I was so flustered, and people clapped. I went back to my seat, and my grandmother tapped me on the knee. She didn't say a word, she just tapped me on the knee and looked at me. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So when I started this book, I thought of her, and my grandmother was still alive, and I was like, how cool to be able to give her this book. So the sad thing is, about I want to say a year and a half ago now, maybe a little less than that, she called me for the first time ever. She had never called me on the phone ever, because she didn't want to bother me. She thought I was like a big, fancy New York writer. And she called me, and I was in the writer's space in Brooklyn where I write, and you cannot have any noise, you can't have your phone on. But I saw that she was calling, even though it was silence, and I went into the phone room, and I was like, hello, Grandma? And she's like, yeah. She goes, I'm bothering you, aren't I? And I was like, no, what's going on? And she goes, I just want to make sure you're okay. Are you okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm okay. And then she died that night, which is pretty crazy, right? And I went into the phone room, and I was like, hello, Grandma? And she's like, yeah. She goes, I'm bothering you, aren't I? And I was like, no, what's going on? And she goes, I just want to make sure you're okay. Are you okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm okay. And then she died that night, which is pretty crazy, right?